actually uses that secret key. So this means that the first step is to actually do something that forces that secret into the cache before you start flushing. So that makes it a complicated attack to launch. You're absolutely right. So the other thing to, yes?
So, there can be multiple values in the cache. Even like, eventually when there's a wrong prediction, but how do we, what's the value of test specific? Because there can, even if you go there, will be multiple.
Well, so we do everything we can to make sure there won't be multiple values in the cache, but there will be because there might be some other things that are referenced. And so we can basically repeat the measurement multiple times to try to get a more clear signal. The other thing is we might not, sometimes you can't learn the complete secret. What you can learn is, maybe it's an RSA key that's 3,000 bits. Maybe you can learn 2,900 bits. You can't learn the last 100 bits because of pollution. Now you just exhaustively trial those keys until you find the right one. So this is good where you're sort of reducing the search space for a key, even if you can't get it completely. So it's still valuable in that way, to sort of leak a partial secret. Okay, any more questions on Spectre? Okay, so we're now going to move to our last vulnerability. This is called Rowhammer. It's a pretty cool vulnerability and has proven to be very resistant to fixing. Everything people do, somebody comes up and finds a way around it. The gist of this is that DRAM is not reliable. It sometimes can have flip bits. It turns out as an attacker, you can make it flip bits. And if you can get those bit flips to be in important places, you can then defeat pretty much every security mechanism out there. And it turns out that reading memory is pretty central to lots of different things in the system. All you have to do to launch this attack is read memory, and so there's lots of ways of launching this attack. So we're to talk about this, we have to dive into kind of the gory details of how DRAM works at a pretty low level. The details aren't that important, but to sort of understand the basics of it, you'll need to see the details. Okay, so this is a DRAM DIMM. If you crack open any computer, you will see a DIMM like this. On it, we have all these different chips. These chips are individual DRAM chips. Each of these individual chips is a bank, and a rank corresponds to both sides. And so what we are going to be doing is looking at multiple memory accesses within a bank and trying to make them sort of cause corruption within a single bank. So this is the organization of DRAM inside a bank. It is organized as a matrix, as an array with rows and columns. The bits are stored sequentially in the rows, and then the columns are either how you feed data in from the top or you read data out at the bottom. So when you actually try to access something, suppose you want to read from row 2, you would then raise the voltage on row 2, and then the contents of row 2 would be copied into the row buffer. And the row buffer is not the size of a cache line. It might be bigger. It might be 1,000 bits or something like that. But we are not reading the data directly. We are copying into a row buffer and then reading it. The other thing to note is that each of these little cells here is a capacitor that stores some charge. When you read it out here, it actually destroys the charge. So once we read it and we copy it to the CPU, we then have to refresh it by writing that value back into the row so that it has the same value it used to. The other thing to know about memory is that the charge degrades over time. We just have like a little capacitor with some electrons. Those electrons kind of wander off. If we don't have enough electrons, we don't know what the value is anymore. So DRAM will periodically, typically every 64 milliseconds, read and write every byte in memory to refresh it so that it stores the right value. Okay, basics of DRAM clear? Hopefully you've seen this somewhere before. Okay, so the challenge is that when you are rewriting things into a row, you're sort of providing a high voltage and it can accidentally disturb the neighboring rows. Normally this isn't much of a problem if you just do it once, but if you do it multiple times, then you have a higher chance of disturbing neighboring rows. And this can conflict. So here we have what are called the aggressor rows. Aggressor rows are rows that we are going to intentionally read lots and lots of times. This will cause us to rewrite it using high voltage lots and lots of times. On either side of these aggressor rows in this matrix are the victim rows. And the victim rows are nearby. And because there's sort of electrical leakage between the rows, when we do this enough, we are going to find that some of the victim rows bits end up flipping, as you can see in this picture. It turns out that the bits that flip is actually pretty deterministic. Every time you attack the same location in memory, the same bits will flip. It's sort of a physical defect in DRAM that some of the capacitors might be slightly smaller. But it's nice as an attacker, you can have sort of a known way to attack where you can sort of know what bits are going to flip during this attack. Okay, so what this means is we have a reliability problem in DRAM that when you rewrite something, the neighboring rows might get slightly corrupted. And we're going to intentionally rewrite things lots and lots of times so we can intentionally trigger corruption. So the way we do this is we need to force reads to DRAM. Normally, when you read from memory, you read it out of the memory once. It goes into the row buffer. When you first read it, it then goes into the processor cache. When you read it again, you read out of the processor cache. So this means if we just read the same address, load the same thing over and over again, we will not be hammering DRAM. The second thing we could do is we could do a CL flush. CL flush is an instruction that forces data out of the entire processor cache hierarchy. So when you do a CL flush and then you load something, the second time you're guaranteed to go back to memory. So we could just do a CL flush on the same address over and over and over again. The problem is when you read things into that row buffer, the data stays in the row buffer for a while. So if you read the same address twice, it'll read from the row buffer and it will not go back to the DRAM cells and disturb the DRAM cells. So what we need instead are to read from two different cache lines on the same bank, so that we can alternate what goes into the row buffer. So we're going to read from X into AX, we're then going to read from Y, we're going to flush things back out and repeat it lots of times. So this means that the row containing X gets read and refreshed, then the row containing Y gets read and refreshed. Each time we do this, we are sort of hammering the DRAM and we are slightly weakening the adjacent row, the bits in the adjacent rows. Any questions so far? So one thing you should be thinking about now is, okay, I can sort of see that, that we can maybe flip some bits in memory. So start thinking now as an attacker. If you could flip some random bits in memory, how would you take advantage of random bit flips, right? You can't flip a particular bit. You can't control where the bit flips happen, but you can flip bits. And so somehow you've got to use that to attack the system. And it's a hard problem, right? It took like PhDs like 10 years to figure this out. So I'm not expecting you to, if you figure it out, that's awesome. You should go get a PhD in computer security research. But think about what you might do with this vulnerability, with this problem. Oh, so one quick note is we need these to be on the same bank, but different rows. It turns out that the way physical addresses are mapped into banks is sort of pretty well determined by your memory controller. Typically, if you add 8 megabytes, you'll sort of be on this data sort of mapped sequentially into banks. And so if you access something 8 megabytes further away, then you will be on the same bank but in a different row. And this is sort of determined experimentally. You can just run a bunch of experiments and see, do they actually collide? Are they running on the same bank? So why do these errors occur? So this is what a normal DRAM cell looks like over time. We've got some charge. Over time, those electrons, they kind of float away someplace. And so the charge will decay. So in this case, a charged cell is a 1, an uncharged cell is a 0. That 1 will decay over time. So we have the refresh that kind of pushes it back up to 1. This is what happens normally. When we're doing the attack, though, we are sort of driving it down because we are repeatedly writing to the cell next to it, which is causing leakage, which is sort of draining those electrons away. So we keep pushing it down every time we read the neighboring rows. And so eventually, if we can push it down below this threshold, there's some threshold where above that threshold means a 1, below means a 0. This means that when we get below the threshold and we then refresh, we're going to refresh it. When we refresh it, we send it to 0 instead because we think there's a 0. And at that point, this bit stores a 0. And so the key is finding some bit in your processor where it decays enough and that between refreshes through hammering that you get from sort of above the threshold to below the threshold. Sort of electrically, it's sort of unclear what happens. At least when I was researching this, the DRAM manufacturers wouldn't really tell people what was going on, but there's some electromagnetic tunneling between adjacent rows. I mean, these things are very small, they're nanometers apart, so electrons don't have to move very far to move from one row to the next. So one thing to note is that as DRAM gets smaller, this problem gets worse because when we have things that are smaller, they're closer together, there is more leakage between them, and so it's easier to get to sort of have this effect. And so the result is that as you get bigger memories, there's sort of more, the memories themselves get sort of less reliable as a result, and there's more memory locations to try to apply this to. So if you only need a couple of flip bits and you have a 64 gigabit system, you've got a lot of bits from which to get something to flip, and the likelihood of something actually flipping goes up. So you have sort of a double effect of why this problem gets worse as we get to denser and denser DRAMs and bigger systems. Any questions? Okay, so that was what we saw was a single-sided Rowhammer where we were sort of attacking both victims on either side of our attacker row. We can also do this by picking aggressor rows on both sides of the victim and writing to them at the same time. So in this case, we're going to write both sides of the victim row, which means that we're hammering it from both sides, and this means that it will sort of get double the amount of hammering between refreshes, and so the chance of a bit goes way up. So this makes it even harder for a DRAM row to sustain the attack. Okay, so we now have the point where we can flip random bits in memory, and the question is, what do we do with this? So there are sort of two initial attacks that people demonstrated, both of which are pretty clever. The first one I'm going to go through is in Google's native client. You might remember back in early February, we talked about sort of sandboxing and how you can sandbox code. Google's native client does this. The way that it does is that if you have a register that you want to jump to, it will mask it, so this will turn off some of the bits. So if we wanted to jump to register 1, we're going to turn off some bits to make sure there's addresses we're not allowed to jump to. We're then going to add a base to it, and this means that the value of register 1 has to be greater than this base of the sandbox, and it's limited to not be too big because we masked off the upper bits. And then we jump to it. So the idea is that if you modify the code, if you somehow got it to jump to the wrong place, this means this code can only jump to known good locations that are sort of within the sandbox memory region. If your value's too big, we're just going to lop off the extra bits and you won't jump there. So this is the mechanism that we're going to try to attack. So our primitive, remember, is to flip some random bits in memory. So we apply Rowhammer, and we're going to try to apply it on this jump to register 1. So what we do is we're going to put code in memory, we're going to apply Rowhammer, we're going to try to flip some bits, and what we do is we hope this jump register 1 changes and becomes jump register 2 by flipping a bit or two in it. Probably become jump register 3, given how binary works. But this means that we are now jumping to a register value which we did not sandbox first, right? We carefully controlled the contents of register 1, so we know it's a safe location. Register 2, the sandbox didn't care about. We're not jumping to it. It can have anything we want. This lets us jump to any location we want by loading it into register 2. So we have defeated the sandboxing mechanism here by changing the register we're jumping to one that is not sandboxed. So the next question is, how do we actually do this, right? How do we find and instruct, how do we sort of make sure when we flip a random bit in memory that we actually flip this one bit and this one instruction in our code? Any thoughts on how we might do that? Yes? right? Okay, so one way to do this, I think you're suggesting, is that if we can profile the system and figure out which bits flip, we can then try to load code and make sure that a vulnerable instruction is at the location where we have a known bit flip. We then apply our tag, we can flip a bit at that location, and it all works. So that works. It can be difficult, in a system with gigabytes of memory to make sure that your vulnerable code is loaded at the physical address where the vulnerability happens, because the kernel controls the allocation of physical memory to virtual memory. So there's other easier ways of doing it. And the way to do it instead is to say, let's just load lots and lots of code. Let's take this code here and we'll repeat it 1 billion times. If we have 1 billion copies of this, and then we flip some bits in memory, there's a high chance that one of those 1 billion copies has a bit flip in it. So we're going to allocate lots of memory. We're going to fill it with lots of code. Google Native Client will sandbox all that code for us dutifully. We then apply Rowhammer. We flip lots of bits all over the place. And then what we can do is we can read memory and see where the bit flips actually happen. So we have this code in memory. We then read through all this memory, and we see, do we see any instances of that jump register 1 that changed to jump register 2? And if we find one of those, then it's like, okay, this is what we use. We then jump to that location where the vulnerable instruction is, execute just that one piece of code, and that sort of lets us jump wherever we want to in the system. So again, the big trick here is we load our vulnerable pattern 1 billion times. We flip some bits somewhere in those 1 billion. We then scan it to figure out what actually flipped. And then we just take advantage of one of the few locations that actually got corrupted. So we don't need to flip any particular bit. We just have to have enough vulnerable bits that one of them will likely get flipped to this attack. So that's what makes it kind of cool. Okay, so this works for sandbox code on Google Native Client. Now, most people don't run this that much, so it may not be that important. But there's another way of doing this that works on any system, on any Linux system. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to attack the kernel page table. So the kernel page table contains the physical address for every virtual page. If we can attack the page tables, and we can get a page table to point to some memory that we control, then we can supply the physical address for some virtual address, and we can reference everything in physical memory. So let's see how this works. So we're going to map a file into memory with read-write permission. Normally, we're going to have some page table entries. These are going to actually say, for each virtual address, where do they correspond to in physical memory. These are stored in the kernel. They're normally not accessible from user mode because the page table entries have physical addresses on them, and they control what physical addresses you can access. So they're very important for security purposes. We're then going to make lots and lots of copies of this file, tons of copies in memory, and use up pretty much all the physical memory making copies of this file if possible. We're going to make lots of copies so that we have lots and lots of PTEs. So our goal is to fill up memory with PTEs. So we want to have gigabytes and gigabytes of PTEs in memory, because when we have a bit flip, we want a page table entry to get corrupted. So then we apply Rowhammer. One of these PTEs gets corrupted and points to some physical page. And ideally, we have some copy that has this PTE in it. We can now modify this PTE to point to other PTEs. So the point is, we now have mapped in user mode a page that is part of a kernel page table, because we corrupted that kernel page table to point here. Yes?
How do you know Rowhammer what exactly we're controlling when that happens?
We don't know what all we're controlling. We do it by sort of reading the data, by reading the things that are accessible and seeing what we find. So by reading through memory, we can sort of see, do we see the vulnerability we're looking for? So what we are doing is we are modifying our kernel page, we're modifying a page table entry so that one of the physical locations that contains page table entries, instead of pointing at kernel memory, now points at user mode memory. So we can now change the entries in the page table. So with user mode, we can now change these page tables, and we can now get access to we can now, by changing an entry, we can now change that page table entry that we control to point to physical memory that the kernel is using. So we can have two page table entries that point to the same physical memory. This lets us map any physical page in the system into our process. We can use that to modify any physical page. So this allows us to modify the kernel and change the code in the kernel to inject shell code into it to make the kernel do whatever we want. So this lets us both read and write all the physical memory and modify the kernel to do anything we want, because we control one page table entry that we get to make point anywhere we want, and then we can read through in user mode. So the key here is that we have this attack. We need to find a critical value. We're flipping one bit that can make the difference between us getting access to something that's critical or not getting access. And by having enough copies, high probability one of those copies will get corrupted. We then scan to find where the corruption is. We take advantage of that to break out of the sandboxing system. Any questions? Okay, so as I said, there's lots of variations. So the first attack was just done from a processor into memory. And people then said, well, can we do this over a network? There's a high-speed networking technology called Remote Direct Memory Access, or RDMA. Lets you read and write remote memory. Guess what? You can apply Rowhammer over a network using RDMA. People then said, well, do we need RDMA for this? And it turns out, no. You can apply this attack over a normal network as well, because when you receive packets, they will overwrite memory. And we can use this to apply this attack over a network and corrupt memory and take over a system over the network. There's a version that works with GPU code. So if you're running like GPU accelerated JavaScript, you can modify the code the GPU is using to apply this attack. And the nice thing is GPUs have really high memory bandwidth, so they can launch a big attack very quickly. And anything the OS is doing, it bypasses when you go through the GPU. So we can attack it. So basically, people have figured out anything that accesses memory can be used as a vector to apply a Rowhammer attack. So it is sort of a big problem. So you might be wondering, what can we do about this? So in thinking about what to do with this, we have to go back to what are the root causes of the problem. So we have a problem that DRAM is sort of weak and leaks. We have a problem that we are sort of able to hammer DRAM and access things lots and lots of times. And we have a problem that the memory that is near us might belong to someone else that's not ours. And so those are all the various ways that we can do to fix it. So one thing we could do is you could, when you buy a system, you could apply Rowhammer for yourself and find all the vulnerable locations that actually get bit flips when you apply Rowhammer. And then you can blacklist those memory locations. And basically you tell the kernel, never allocate this memory because it might get corrupted. So this reduces your capacity because there's a bunch of locations you can't lose, but at least the remaining memory is not vulnerable to Rowhammer. So that's one approach. It also takes a while to actually attack your whole system this way. Another thing you could do is you could increase the refresh rate. Remember, we saw that over time, that the problem is that we're wearing down the signal before it gets refreshed. If we make the refresh rate 4 times faster, then we can't really wear it down fast enough. The problem is that refreshing uses a lot of power and it slows things down. And so if we increase the refresh rate, then it makes our system slower and use more power, which people don't like. Another thing you could do is build better DRAM. And the problem is that DRAM is a very competitive business. People try to build the worst possible DRAM right now to make it cheaper. And so if your DRAM costs twice as much because it's more reliable, precisely nobody will pay for it to defend against this attack. Because as we saw in the Yahoo case, people don't want to invest in security because everybody is very price sensitive. So one thing you can do is add error correcting codes. So error correcting codes take your memory and they store additional information so they can detect if any bits have been flipped. When you read the data in, you can apply the error correcting code and correct any bit flips. So this helps. It turns out I was in the Netherlands last year, and the group there working on this found that they can break error correcting codes also. So even though you have some kind of error correcting code, they can sort of figure out various places where the error correcting code will not work, target those, and then launch the same attacks they had before. So error correcting codes are not, they help, they make it harder, but they don't fix it. Another thing you can do is conceal physical addresses. So, you know, we had, to some extent, knowing physical addresses helps because that's how we can find addresses that are in different banks. If we hide physical addresses, it's harder to find addresses in different banks. So the challenge here is that we have to turn off what are called huge pages, which are used to make your translation look-aside buffer more efficient. Again, we're hurting performance. So everything here kind of hurts performance or power. The final thing we can do, or another thing we can do, is, you know, in the first case, we disable the vulnerable row. Another option is to say we're going to use these, but we're only going to use them as a cache. And we're always going to checksum the data so that before we use the data, we'll verify the checksum to see if it's changed. So as long as no one's attacking us, we can store data there. But if someone's attacking us, you know, sometimes we'll lose things in the cache. So we're finding sort of a weaker use for memory where we can afford to have some bit flips. So the net result is that I think that the way things stand today is that Android has some defenses against Rowhammer. They work to conceal physical addresses as part of their heap allocator to make it harder. Many people worried about this are buying ECC memory, which makes it a lot harder. But there is still sort of no known guaranteed foolproof mechanism to defend against Rowhammer. Any questions on Rowhammer? Yes?
Do you know like what percent of your memory you will lose if you like collect the vulnerable rows?
I don't remember offhand. I think if you look through the reading, it has some numbers. And the thing to note is that the vulnerabilities, it varies by what DRAM manufacturer you have. Some DRAM is better than others. And so in some cases it might not be much, in some cases it might be more. But I don't remember. There's a number of like 8% that sticks with me, but I don't remember 8% of what. So it's a great question. Other questions? So, and sort of looking back over Harvard vulnerabilities, there's a couple things that we see. So these are sort of themes of where these vulnerabilities are coming from. One is that optimizations that make things run faster change the timing of instructions, and that timing is visible and we can use it to measure whether the optimization was used or not used. So this gives us a way to sort of read internal processor state by changing the timing. This is not part of the architectural specification. It's not supposed to matter, but it's a leakage channel from the processor to the outside world. The second thing we see is that speculation changes that microarchitectural state even if we undo it later. And so by speculating that we can reference something, speculating in which way we branch, we're going to change the microarchitectural state, and then we can apply the optimizations to try to read that information out later. So this means that we have a way to sort of write a signal through speculation. We have a way to read the signal through sort of measuring that state. The other thing that we see is that if you have a reliability problem in your system, if there's a way for an attacker to deterministically trigger that reliability problem, it turns into a security problem. It could turn into a denial of service attack if they can crash your system. It could turn into a privilege escalation attack, as we just saw, if they can use it to sort of flip some bits in memory. And the key trick here is how do we take sort of random bugs and make the scope of what is vulnerable big enough that we can actually attack something reasonable.